This is Talking Drupal. We are a bi-weekly chat about web design and development by a group of guys with one thing in common. Actually, it's probably more than one thing in common, but for today it's we love Drupal. We record this every other Wednesday afternoon in a Google Hangout. Visit us at talkingdrupal.com. This is episode 100, believe it or not. Wednesday, July 29th. We're going to call this episode The Century. Welcome, one and all, to our show this week.
Good afternoon.
Is everyone there?
Hey, guys.
Okay, so
Who
we're
is that?
episode 100, so we have a familiar voice back. So let's start there. Boy, we had I don't know when you disappeared from us, Jason. What episode was that? Maybe
I don't remember
30
that.
ago or something. Beginning of this year. I don't know when it was.
Somewhere in the 70s, but it was about 5 months ago.
5 months ago. So Jason was here from the beginning, and he had some life changes and some priority changes, and he's disappeared from this podcast, but we still have him every week and bring up his name very often. So Jason Palmental is joining us. For those who don't know who he is, because you've just joined us recently, he is the lead UX strategist at Fresh Tilled Soil in Boston. He's also the author of the Responsive Typography book from O'Reilly. His accolades go on, but I'll just keep it to a short list. He's the vice chair of the Rhode Island State Council of the Arts. I don't know what that means, but I imagine it comes with some sort of badge and a fancy jacket that he wears.
Looks good on the actually a beret. I have to wear a beret.
Oh, it's a beret. There we go. Jason will also be the keynote speaker at the upcoming Drupal camp in Connecticut. That is on, I think, August 22nd.
Yep.
Is that date right? Yeah. So if you're local to New England, you can see him there. Actually, you can see him pretty much at any Drupal camp in New England or most of the events that are going on. He is a lover of cycling, a lover of his family, and a lover of his dog. So, Jason, for those who don't know you, welcome to the show. Welcome back, and we're glad to have you today.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. I've missed the show. I still see you guys at our meetups and stuff, but the show is fun and nice to have time to do it.
Yeah, the four of us still get together on a regular basis, but the Wednesday gathering Jason hasn't been involved with. So today's show is number 100, and also joining us is John Picozzi from Oomph. Welcome, John.
Good afternoon, Internet friends.
So here we are, John, at 100. What does that mean to you?
Man, 100, that's a big milestone. It doesn't actually seem like we've done this 100 times. It seems like
200?
far less, actually. So that's awesome. I'm really glad to know personally that it's not feeling old yet. So
that's good.
It's good. It's good for me.
So one thing that we changed, I think it was like 3 or 4 months ago, is that we've gone bi-weekly. And one of the things that the listeners don't necessarily know all the time is that we meet weekly. So every Wednesday at 1 o'clock we get together. What we've changed is we get together and prepare for the show for the next week. So why our title, and I always say it wrong, or sometimes I say it wrong, I say it's a weekly podcast. It's actually a weekly get-together with a bi-weekly podcast. So we still, all of us meet on a weekly basis. And the other person we meet with is Nick Laughlin from Enlightened Design.
Good afternoon. It's going to be good to look back over the last couple of years. It's kind of hard to believe how quickly we've gotten 100, but it's been a good run.
Yeah, it's been fun. So our show today is, we didn't want to go crazy on 100. We're not sure if even hitting 100 means anything. Other than probably most podcasts don't make it past 10 or 11 shows, so we're way past that.
So we're just really stubborn. That's stubbornly persistent, I think.
That's exactly what it is.
Even Serial only made it to 12 episodes.
That's right. That's true. Yeah, and there's been some spin-off shows from that, by the way.
Yeah.
So if you're not familiar with the Serial podcast, you absolutely should check that out because it's great audio content from NPR, right? It's from NPR.
Yep.
So today's show, what we figured we'd do is, each of us look back through the previous 99 episodes, pick something that we'd like to revisit. And we could probably pick more than half of those shows and revisit them, but we still only try to keep this to an hour. So we're going to pick one thing and then see how it goes. You never know how these things go. So let's start with Jason's pick, which is somewhat of an obvious one based on what his skills and expertise is episode 8. So we're talking, 2 years ago we had a show on responsive design, and really it's kind of shocking we haven't had another one since, and maybe that should get into our agenda pretty soon.
Yeah, I mean, so much has changed. Specs have been ratified, techniques have improved. Just the way we think about stuff and approach the projects has really evolved. And I'm sure that these guys were rolling their eyes when I said we should talk about responsive design, but it's the thing that I'm still most closely involved in. I don't get to work with Drupal every day in this job, but everything we do is responsive. Every single site, it's not an option. So we think about accessibility, we think about different techniques and technologies to build into it, and coming back into doing a Drupal project right now because we're working on one with Oomph. Actually, I'm working with John and Kathy and my wife, who's over there at Oomph now as well, on a really cool, interesting Drupal project, and we've been building in as many of these new ideas into that project as we go. It's been really interesting.
Jason, how many sites, I'm not sure if you know this percentage, but what is the percentage of sites out there right now that are still not responsive? Do you have any sense of what that is? And we didn't give you a whole lot of time to do a show prep here, so I understand that. I'm wondering if you have a sense of what that is, and then maybe what that is in maybe the top 10% of the internet.
I think that the latest numbers that I'm remembering from, and it is mainly from listening to things like the Responsive Design Web Design podcast that Ethan Marcotte and Karen McGrain do. Maybe 25 to 30% of the top trafficked sites. Maybe it's more than that, but I don't think it's really that much more are responsive.
Are you finding that you run into websites or prospects that you're working with that still don't have a responsive or a mobile strategy whatsoever?
Yeah.
That's still a main issue.
It's I think it's on most people's. Well, so I suppose I should back up for a second and fresh tilled soil and the kinds of work that we do are typically larger scale sites and digital products and application design, and we focus almost exclusively on the design and strategy, and we'll take it through front-end prototypes and coded style guides and pattern libraries, or in some cases we'll carry through to a full build, but generally not. So because of working with some larger universities and corporations and stuff, they usually at least have an idea. They know what it is. I don't think it's really generally an issue in selling that to people, which, and I think that if you take a more holistic view of the entire world of people building things for the web, I think it's still a much lower percentage of people who know about responsive design. I think it's certainly improved, but we've been fortunate that we haven't had to work too hard to really sell people on that idea.
So most people are familiar with the concept, they just haven't implemented it.
Yeah, or if they have, usually it's sort of an early attempt. It's not terribly thorough. It might be something that's kind of bolted on top of an existing system rather than really rethinking it from the beginning.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
So so in the past 12 to 18 months, what kind of things have changed?
Well, we've seen that the picture element in responsive images has been ratified and is starting to be supported better in browsers. And Picture Fill does a really good job of making sure that that is functional in older browsers. So that's one thing that I think actually fits really nicely with Drupal. And it was something I was really excited about working on with John and Kathy. We combined the image field focus module with a custom view that wraps everything in a picture element with different size and aspect ratio crops for different screen sizes.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually can get at some, sort of attempt at art direction for photos, so that you could have a square crop versus a landscape one, and not lose the important focus area of the image. So you can deliver better assets for different screen sizes.
So you mentioned the picture. When you say picture, you're talking about the picture module in Drupal?
Actually, no. I'm talking about, and so this has been kind of an interesting time for me in working in sort of pure HTML, CSS markup, and then trying to map everything back to Drupal. I looked at some of the responsive image modules that were out there, and I wasn't sure they were really going to deliver quite what I wanted. So I went with a combination of the image field focus module, image presets, and creating a view that I could give, basically give an image ID that I wanted, and then it would pull out different presets and format all the HTML the way I want it to get a picture element. And then I built Picture Fill into the theme, and we're able to get a really nice responsive image solution in there without adding any additional overhead for modules or requirements on the part of the administrator, other than add the image, click and drag to create the focus area that you want to preserve, and that's it.
So the picture, so the image focus module is the module that allows the user to basically use their mouse to focus, draw a rectangle on an image.
Yep.
And those coordinates are basically saved as part of the image element.
And you make image style presets that are tied into that module.
Right, and they work with it. Correct.
Yep.
So then where is the piece that I'm not following is where does the responsive stuff come into this?
I created a view, and we feed in an ID set that we want, and then it writes out HTML. It pulls out the different presets that we want based on the breakpoints that we're trying to support, and I've written the HTML in a custom view text field, and I drop in the links to the presets for these images. So it writes out an HTML5 picture element with everything in there, including the fallback image source, and then that is what gets dropped into the page when we want to display that image.
Is there a particular reason that you didn't look at the picture module? There might not be one, by the way.
It didn't seem like it was really going to give the flexibility that I wanted, and it seemed like it was going to add a lot of extra steps to essentially get at the same thing. And we've been, so one of the mandates that I have from our technical director here is to make him believe that this markup is as good as it would be if we wrote it by hand, or at least darn close.
Meaning, when you say this markup, you mean Drupal produced markup?
Yep. And so the combination of using...
I'm kind of interested in that demand because...
Yeah, me too, but I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so because it's coming from Drupal or because it's coming from a CMS in general?
Well,
and does your agency have a specific CMS that they recommend that does exactly that?
Well, so a lot of what we do is actually passing off HTML, CSS, JavaScript templates. So it's not working with any CMS at all.
Yep.
Before I started here, when they would get in something that needed to be in a CMS, they would use WordPress. And they have their own particular set of things they do with WordPress to produce the least amount of markup.
Mm-hmm.
So they build in, it's essentially the same kind of things that we do in Drupal. They just don't know Drupal. And so what I've been trying to do is I rewrote Beep Edition to be mapped more closely with the way we write code here.
And Beep Edition is a theme that you have in
Yep.
Drupal that's a responsive theme.
Yep. So that was completely rewritten, and that combination with so I'm unsetting some of the core Drupal styles so they're not getting echoed out. A lot of the templates are there to remove extra layers of divs. We're using the semantic views and fences and HTML5 tools and block class to strip back and get rid of a lot of the layers of stuff. So it has managed to remove a significant portion of the HTML that's being output by Drupal. And this was just another attempt to try and get something that was peeled back to just the bare minimum so that we could take that and drop it in as a nice repeatable pattern. So it's a combination of all those things. It's not just because it's Drupal. It's because it's Drupal. It's a CMS, and
it's what your company's delivering as a final product.
Yeah.
Which is very different from just delivering HTML. And if someone sticks it in Drupal and there's a lot of markup, you know what I mean, that's not your issue as a company. You delivered the clean markup in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so my goal with this was, one, to show that we can still deliver a really high quality result when it's in a different CMS than the one that they're used to.
Right.
And make us feel comfortable that we're delivering it in the right CMS and still delivering the right results. It's really accessible.
Yeah.
It works with and without JavaScript. It's very performant. So because all that stuff comes back to for performance too. We want to reduce the amount of markup. We want to reduce. We want to deliver the best assets to the browser so that we're getting the fastest possible site.
Great. So if someone's doing responsive work in Drupal, where do you stand today at the things they should look at? What are your top 3 tips here for them?
I think the first and foremost thing is to, if you are going to go with a base theme of some kind or a starting point, get to know it really well, because I think that there's a lot of unevenness in approach, and a lot of different ways to get to what might look like the same place, but in reality may have a lot of challenges. So making sure that the markup that gets generated is really reliable, that it's going to work in the broadest set of circumstances. So getting to know that theme is probably the number one thing, and getting to know the modules that will help you get there. Because in Drupal 7, you still have to, you still need to add in a few key modules like HTML5 tools, entities, fences, semantic views, block class. I think those are like kind of the major ones that I always start with, that help give you the options and kind of to trim back on some of the layers of extra classes and wrappers. That alone can take away like 3 or 4 layers of divs and extra classes that you don't need. And block class helps you be really explicit about what it is that you want to create your markup around. Following really good practices in writing CSS so that you're making repeatable patterns really depends on having a predictable set of classes that are wrapping lists of content, and that card-like metaphor of like, here's a blog post teaser, here's a person, and have that in a nice, consistent, repeatable set of HTML tags and classes that you can tie into.
So I have a question then about that, because one of your stated goals is to remove the number of modules installed, and to that end you wrote the view, you wrote a custom template for the picture element. Why do you use block class rather than use function and template PHP to apply the class instead of using block class just for prototyping?
Well, to be perfectly honest, Nick, that's sort of zooming past my level of comfort. Block classes it's super easy. So it's something that, could we probably squeeze a little more performance out of doing it that way? Maybe. If it's a mostly anonymous viewer kind of site, it probably doesn't matter. I think the end resulting markup that you'd get would be the same, or it could be the same. It's just the time to build the page, and if the page is largely being cached, then convenience wins for me.
Isn't it partly also because you're creating a block anyway? Why not stick the appropriate class on it?
Well, I think Nick's talking about using a function to add the class rather than a module, right?
Yeah, and I personally use block class myself. There's just some people that think block class should only be used for prototyping. I think the biggest reason is if it's a function, there's no way for an end user to change it, which would completely break the layout.
True.
So if you're allowing people access to the blocks for other reasons and they change the class,
that's your first mistake.
Well,
yeah, I mean, but to pinpoint that one thing is the issue with giving access to users is a little bit short-sighted, because there's a lot of things they can do that could break it.
Yeah.
I personally use block class all the time.
Yeah. So Nick, I would say, like, flipping that around, that having the module there and making something that can be done through configuration means that you can add new functionality to the site, and if it matches existing style guide patterns, you can make that stuff just work.
Yep.
So, I mean, in that respect, that makes it more powerful to be able to do that. I mean, clearly, if you're giving users the ability to edit blocks, that needs to, there's a whole lot of other concerns there. I would probably come down on the side of there's a lot of benefits and the negatives are manageable.
Yeah, I agree with Jason on this. I actually have a site that I'm working on, or that I'm continually working on, and one of the things that we do very regularly is duplicate a views block, or duplicate a view to create a block to show a certain set of products on a certain page. And if I were using some sort of template function, I would have to update code every time I wanted to create one of those blocks, as opposed to just going in and adding the block class to it and having the display just work, because everything is already been coded for that. So, yeah, I definitely, as with anything, it's definitely situational, but I definitely opt for block class in a lot of cases.
Well, just to continue playing devil's advocate, because for the record, I tend to agree with you guys as well. Depending on if you're just cloning a display, not a view, the function can be written in a way that displays that class across every display in the view. So you wouldn't necessarily have to edit code just because you're cloning a display. But yeah, I mean, I generally agree as well. So we don't need to.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think it really comes down to more. To me, it seems like more a question of performance than anything else. And if you have tons of logged-in users where a lot of this code will be getting executed more and more, then I could totally see that being a valid way to go. I mean,
Jason, I actually think it's more a matter of what your. It's not just because it's always performance. So I'm also wondering if it's really just a matter of what you do as a company in terms of process when you decide something stays in the database versus when it goes to code.
Right.
And I know that over time, I know Nick particularly has been a guy that moved from I don't put any code anywhere to a guy who now is, I think, leaning towards code it when you can. And maybe I'm stepping over the bounds there, Nick, but I think you've sort of switched your position on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, it in some cases, yes, and like I said, I'm definitely playing devil's advocate here. But in block class's defense, the module's like 100 lines long. It's not particularly performance draining.
Is block class in Drupal 8 like the functionality of it? I remember I looked at it maybe 6 months ago, and I can't remember if it was built into the blocks in Drupal 8 or not. I don't think it was.
I don't know. I thought that maybe it did have that flexibility. I honestly don't remember.
I don't think it ended up in there.
I mean, I think one of the things that for me, in terms of like that configuration versus code discussion, because I want to enable site builders to add new things to the site, I tend to come down on the side of like if we write a really good style guide and pattern library, we're giving them the rules to add new content and functionality to the site and maintain the design and the style. And that means they have to be able to add the right classes to the right elements.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes there more configuration in the blocks, but less effort to maintain the overall style and design of the site. Right. And that's we try and opt for that wherever we can.
Right, I agree with you. Also, I think it also comes down on what you define as a site, what a site builder's role is, and what skills they have. So let's move on. Let's move on to the second. So we revisited episode 8. Let's now revisit episode 58 from August 6, 2014. And this one is REST. In that episode, we talked about what REST is and how you could use it in building a site. And Nick wanted to revisit that today. So, Nick, what are the things here that jumps out at you as why we should be looking at this a year later?
Because napping is important.
Because what?
Because napping is important.
Yes, of course. Okay.
I just got it. REST and napping. Thank you, John.
That's a dad joke if I've ever heard one.
That's as bad a joke as we've ever had.
So, I mean, the reason why I think REST is important is, it hasn't changed too much over the last year. If anything, it's got more important. And it's the ability to have interconnected systems. Sometimes those systems are both Drupal, sometimes neither is Drupal, sometimes some of them are Drupal and some are not. So what REST allows you to do is connect to outside systems and bring the data into your system, so that you can manipulate it with views, you can manipulate it with with all the regular tools that Drupal provides. When you're building an API, REST-WS doesn't. REST-WS helps somewhat. It provides endpoints for some of your nodes, provides an ability to make modifications and changes. But if you're looking at providing an API that has some filtering or views type qualities, you're going to have to use a couple of other modules. You definitely. I also would like to mention that there's been some work on the REST-WS module. I know last year when we talked about it, there were several patches that I had to apply to get both files, multiple value fields and taxonomies working. Since then, there's been a new submodule for adding files through REST, and there have been fixes for the test and for taxonomy, so now taxonomy supposedly works outside the box.
So Nick, on the project that you were working on a year ago that I'm familiar with, I mean, REST worked at a superficial level. But when you needed to dig into, like, complex, not even complex, like real world
Yeah.
content types, it started to fall apart. Do you feel that over the past year that those pieces have been addressed at this point? Because
So
because
on the surface,
I do know
yeah.
that you wrote a lot of patch code or put a lot of code in there to make these things work.
Yeah, on the surface, it looks like everything has been fixed. And I say on the surface because as you said, my code base is forked fairly significantly from the module. So I can't, I'm not on the upgrade path. I can't just upgrade it and expect my site to work anymore. It's close enough that when security releases come out, I can go through and patch my module, make sure it's secure. But I haven't necessarily installed the new file module. I haven't installed the new REST module.
Mm.
I think part of the importance isn't just the REST WS module, but the fact that it's now in core Drupal 8. And the fact that it's core means that things like this are going to be tested more rigorously. And the whole purpose of REST WS was kind of a prototype backport of the Drupal 8 functionality to kind of prove viability. So I'm certainly excited for, this is definitely one of the big things that I'm excited for in Drupal 8. I think it will open a whole new world of interconnection between Drupal and other systems. And as of right now, Drupal 8, I know we had a show about it a couple weeks ago, Drupal 8 is supposed to, expected to release, according to the website, on August 20th. So there's only 10 critical issues.
According to what website?
The Drupal 8 release.
Drupal release date.
Which is only a calculation of dates and times.
Yeah,
That's not an official announcement.
Not official, but it's it's certainly good at tracking how critical issues have been decreasing over time, and how major issues have been increasing over time.
Well, it's down to only 10.
10.
So Nick,
Nick,
go ahead, John.
I was just gonna ask Nick to talk a little bit about headless Drupal, because essentially, I mean, that's a big part of what REST does, right? It allows you to build a headless Drupal website, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. It's not, so headless Drupal isn't something I've necessarily kept up on completely over the last year. I think it still has some merits, but I think it still has some inherent questions that were there last year, like why, why are you not using Drupal to serve the data, or why are you using Drupal to display the data, but not using any of the internal tools of Drupal to manage the data?
Well, Nick, I think that using like headless Drupal, I think, does leverage some of the best parts of Drupal in content modeling and content management. I think my biggest issue with the headless aspect of it is that quite often then people are saying, okay, we'll build it in Angular, or we'll like something like that, which is completely inaccessible when JavaScript goes away, and it goes away.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like all the time, and people really overlook some of those significant issues with that, and I think that's a real shame. I mean, there's lots of ways to do something.
Jason, when you say JavaScript goes away and it goes away all the time, I mean, put a little bit more bounds around what you mean by that, please.
Every single page exists in a state without JavaScript at some point in the load cycle.
Absolutely.
And so it is virtually guaranteed that there will be, a significant point during the loading of this site when the user can do nothing. And if anything happens, then there's nothing delivered. And so there's, some people in the office actually have done some experiments on disabling JavaScript on their phones, and their web browsing experience is lightning fast. I mean, that is by far the largest slowdown on any website is going to be loading of JavaScript. I mean, you have to try it. Like, you have to try it. It is just night and day. It means that a lot of things don't load. You don't get Instagram's web interface. You don't get weather.com's data at all. I mean, there's a whole bunch of sites where this happens, but it's not just a matter of whether or not the JavaScript loads and functions. I just think even though technically it may draw a page quickly, there is such a significant amount of latency on devices and the amount of power it requires for them to manage it, and the amount of bandwidth and the speed of that bandwidth that's required. I think that we're becoming very lazy and is making a lot of assumptions on processor speed and bandwidth availability, where basic web stuff would do.
Yeah, so I agree with you and disagree with you both. I mean, I don't think it's fair to call people lazy.
I'm saying
I think the operative word though is practical, a little bit there.
Oh, I don't think that's the right word. When I say lazy, I mean like we have these assumptions. I mean, come on, Steve. Let's think back to the early part of our web career, and go back to
Jason. You don't have to actually convince me of the issue. I understand the issue, and I understand the importance of it. I also don't think we should ignore the practicality of saying that we should have an expectation at some point. And is it unreasonable to build a website expecting that people have JavaScript? And there could be a fallback to say if they don't, but that is really a small case today. And I think you're saying that it's a much larger case than people aren't having JavaScript than it really is.
Well, and I also
I don't think people should be building a site around not having JavaScript.
I think if you are trying to adhere to the notion of progressive enhancement, you absolutely build it without JavaScript, and then you layer the JavaScript on to add better functionality.
Sure.
I mean, that's the way we're going about making the interface for this website that I'm working on with John. Sure. You can turn JavaScript off, and you still have a nice responsive menu system. You can still navigate the website, and when you turn the JavaScript on, it adds extra functionality. I mean, I understand that there are, people could say there are differences between I'm building an app versus I'm building a content-focused website, but I think that in both cases, building it however you want and then going back to make it okay when things don't work is a crappy way to work. And I think it's a recipe for things getting cut and not done, and I think you end up shorting a lot of users that way.
So you're saying similar to responsive design's whole general philosophy of start at the mobile and work your way up, you're saying when you're working with headless Drupal or with JavaScript in general, you should work with the assumption no JavaScript first, get that functionality nailed down, and then add JavaScript.
Yeah, I mean, if we're delivering content over the web into something that consumes HTML and CSS, then make that stuff work first, and then start building on layers of interaction, and then you could build in the more, the communication of AJAX-type interactions. But Drupal does a pretty awesome job of making sure all that stuff works. Turn JavaScript off, you can still edit views. You can still do everything. I mean, I think it's a great example of progressive enhancement in action. I think it's really important if you're building anything that's being delivered over the web that you keep that in mind.
That's one of the great benefits of using Drupal is that stuff is sort of baked in.
Yeah.
And you don't
have to work
think
to break
about
it
it until you start to do some serious customizations and yeah.
I mean, I admit that was a bit of a rant, but I think Nick, the whole headless aspect of it as a way to build content to populate an app, though, I think is kind of awesome. I mean, being able to use Drupal as the source of content that's being pulled in, for like native apps and stuff, absolutely, it's a fantastic use of it.
Yeah, I agree, and that's one of the reasons why I'm most excited for Drupal 8. And the ability to have one single source for content where you're in a unified content workflow management system, and then you can display that information on apps, on billboards, on the web, on phones, wherever you need to display it. you can have some sort of interface that is being pulled from, and that's where that's probably the number one thing I'm excited for in Drupal 8. I think it's going to be similar to how views, views really made Drupal 5 and 6, into what Drupal 7 became, and I think REST is, the next evolution.
What's interesting is that on episode 102, so that'd be 4 weeks from now, roughly, on August 26th, we have Matt Gill and David Dyers joining us from Four Kitchens, and they've just implemented the new twit.tv website, which is based on a Drupal headless implementation with Node.js. So they're going to be joining us that day to talk about that implementation, and we'll learn a whole lot more about headless Drupal on that day.
Really excited about that show. It's going to be a good time.
I agree.
That's awesome.
All right, great. So, where are we at our checklist? We're going to talk about translation here a little bit.
Yeah, so
one of the things that John has just been super excited about all the time is translation, and translation using some particular vendors with Drupal. John, tell us about it.
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of work with translation over the last almost a year now, it looks like. So our multilingual show was on August 20th of 2014. So over the last year, I've been doing quite a bit with translating content, and I've fallen into some pit holes, and I've got myself out of them and then moved along. But one of the things that I'm really excited about is the use of translation services. And basically, what a translation service is, if you couldn't infer from the name, is it's a service that helps you translate your content. Most recently, I've been using Lingotech as my preferred translation service of choice. Translation service aside, I've actually learned a whole bunch about translation, in particular to the different types of translation, node translation versus entity translation, and the fact that in my personal opinion, and clearly the Drupal community's opinion too, entity translation is definitely the way to go. That being said, entity translation will be the only method for translation in Drupal 8. So I'm really excited about that, especially right now because I'm battling a entity versus node translation menu issue that doesn't seem to be giving up as easy as I hoped it had. So a lot in the past year. I've done a lot in the past year with translation, and I think it's really very interesting. I'm also excited that Drupal will have translation baked in or in core in Drupal 8. So Drupal has some translation functionality or locality functionality built in to core now, but if you want entity translation, you actually have to download a separate set of modules. So having that built right into Drupal 8 is going to be awesome.
So, John, I have a couple of questions. If someone's should someone who's building a Drupal project and there's no requirement up front for translation, but should they plan on it anyway and prepare themselves that maybe it's an option down the road? Is that a way? Is this something you can do to prepare for translation but not implement it? Or do you just ignore it?
Yeah, the biggest issue there that I've come across is with views, especially with entity translation, because the way that Vue pulls content in, if you're not doing anything with translation, is you go to the view, you select title, the title field, the body field, and it shows up, right? Well, with entity translation, there's actually entity translation fields that you need to put into your view if you want that content to be translated on the output. So there's an entity translation title, there's an entity translation body maybe, or a specific field if you created a field, say for like person's name or something like that. Anything that goes through a basically entity would require you to add an entity translation field. So that was the biggest hurdle for me. I recently did take a site that had already been built and add translation to it. And it did take longer because I had to kind of recode or rebuild some of those views or tweak some of those views to allow for translation.
So is there a path, or is it recommended or a good idea to build a site assuming translation, even though it's not a requirement? Because it's less time. Is it less work to do up front if you just sort of build it in?
Isn't it still more work though, John, with creating the views and stuff?
Yeah, so it could. It may be negligible. Let's put it that way. If you start off a site and there's no translation is not on the board.
It's English. It's English.
Right. It's an English site, and you think there may be translation later on, and you add it in. You got to factor that into your budget. If you have extra time and you think that would be a good way to spend it, then yeah, I would factor it in from the beginning. Can't hurt. But ultimately, it's not going to take a significantly more time for you to do translation in the middle or the end of a project. I
guess that's really what I was getting at. If I have a website that's already up and running, and I now need to produce it in Spanish, you're saying that that's.
Well, it's got to be. I mean, I would imagine it's like at least 10% more work. I don't know, I'm making up a number, but it's not just turning the modules on, because like John said, you have to go back and change the views to use the entity translation fields and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would say it's probably like 5% more work to do it after the site's been built, just because you're going to spend, most of what you're going to be setting up is you're going to be turning on modules and entering translation. If you're using a translation service, you're going to be setting that up. You're going to have to do that anyway. What you're going to spend a lot of time doing is going back to views you've already created and swapping out fields or selecting translated text as the output for those views. So
I'm curious then, because under the Advanced tab for views, there's a field language option. Does that not work with entity translation? It allows you to say, for example, the field should be the current user's language or the default language or a specific language or undefined. That doesn't work with entity translation?
So that's basically, as I understand it, that's basically making sure that the view knows what the language is itself, but that doesn't apply to the fields that are within that view. So it's not like it's going to say, hey, all my fields, go get your Spanish translations and put those in.
Okay.
Most all views are actually set to the user's language in most cases if you have translation enabled. But getting the actual translated words in there require you to swap out some fields.
Okay. I didn't know that.
John, so getting started with translation, what do you recommend people doing? Are there some particular resources that they should look at? If this is something they want to do?
Yeah, so there are a ton of resources on Drupal.org about translation. There's actually a whole page that has a list of modules that can help you figure out what modules you'll need for translation. I recommend, like I said, going with entity translation over node translation. It's gonna cut down on the amount of duplicate content you have or duplicate nodes you have. If you actually go to the video library for DrupalCon LA, there was a great talk on getting started with translation The person that gave it is, I am not remembering their name, but there was a ton of great modules in there, most of which I had heard of, but some of them were new to me. So that would be a great place to get started as well.
I think translation's often a scary thing.
Yeah,
People
it
never
can
done
be.
it, yeah.
You know, when I first got started with it, I was kind of like, oh man, this is a really daunting task. I don't really know anything about this. And, you know, my two big things are use entity translation and use a translation service because it's going to save you time and money.
Yeah, and there's a couple other things to think about. You know, how you're going to translate the menus. You know, how you're going to handle switching languages. I mean, it's not. You know, you turn on a couple modules, you hire the service, and it's done. There's still additional planning that you have to do that if you haven't ever done, you know, multilingual sites, is going to be brand new to you. But it's not insurmountable. And using the tips that John just gave will save you tons of time.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, the thing that a lot of people forget about is the implications that can have on design. I mean, if it's a right-to-left language, you need to think about block placement and, you know, what regions things are in, and directions of floats and stuff like that, and the difference in length. So, you know, with this site that I'm working on with John, it's going to be in at least English and Spanish and probably some other languages eventually, and we're, you know, just like putting in the Spanish language stuff so that we can check for reflowing of menu items and stuff like that, just so we can at least get the baseline down. But, you know, like the average length of language in English to German, like German's 40% longer. So, you know, you really have to think about that in your layout and menu structures and things like that too.
Yeah, we actually saw, we translated into French, and there was one phrase that was like email, newsletter, sign up, or something like that. And it was, you know, email, newsletter, sign up is like 3 words, right? In French, it ended up being like 6 really small, but ended up being much longer words. So that, you mean, those are things you think about, because your little box that says that is only so many pixels wide, and then when that text gets so much bigger, you end up, you know, it ends up breaking in some way. So it's kind of interesting to me that in those same kinds of considerations really reinforces the way you probably should be working anyway in creating a responsive website. Because if you're working in a CMS, the design has to accommodate the fact that you don't know how long the string is going to be tomorrow, and making sure that your styles and everything are done in a way to accommodate that is critical.
Boy, that's not just a responsive website, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a real challenge, because especially when you're thinking about it, like looking at design files and trying to translate that into something that's really appropriate for the web. And you know, the nature of most design files is that they are static and they have pixel measurements, and you always have to be thinking about, you know, how am I doing this relative to everything else on the screen?
So when we were talking about the module of the week, Flex Slider came up, and we were shocked that Flex Slider was never discussed, or was maybe mentioned in passing over the past 2 years, right?
Yep.
So,
yeah, it was pretty surprising, considering I use it on probably 50% of all the websites that I build.
Yeah, that sounds low, actually.
right, yeah. So
I might use it more now.
So our module of the week is Flex Slider.
Yep. And for those who don't know what Flex Slider is, it is it's just a module that integrates a JavaScript library that allows you to create content, usually images, content that rotates automatically. It's responsive, and I think it has fairly good fallbacks, but it's pretty easy to use with views, with fields, and you can configure them many, many different ways. So you can add, you know, for example, keyboard navigation, you can add thumbnail navigation, you can add, you can connect sliders together. I mean, there's a lot of stuff you can do with it.
It also seamlessly handles touch navigation, so it's swipeable when you're on small screens.
Good point.
And it's super easy to layer together lots of content. So it could be an image with like different text overlays and links and buttons and all that stuff, and it slides beautifully.
Very cool.
As long as you have JavaScript installed.
Well, it does have.
Don't get him started.
No, it's got a pretty good fallback. I mean, it does. It works. It works pretty nicely. You get a thing. I mean, it doesn't leave you with nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It does have a good fallback.
But what I was going to say, I've never. I'm not sure if I've ever actually used the module, but I've used Flex Slider itself pretty much since it. I don't know. I mean, I used it like with Drupal 6 sites years ago. I mean, like whenever we did anything at Schoolyard, so going back like 4 or 5 years, we were using Flex Slider, and I didn't have anything to do with the module, but I will claim a little credit in going back to the original developer of Flex Slider and asking him to make it work with jQuery 132 so that we could make it work in Drupal 6, and he was kind enough to do that. So Flex Slider up to, I think, 1.8 or 1.9 in the original jQuery plugin was compatible with the earlier version of jQuery, so you could use it with Drupal 6.
I'd say the one thing I've run up against that it doesn't do well is it doesn't, for the content loads, it doesn't reserve the space on the page.
Yeah.
So if we have more than 1 or 2 images, you'll end up with a shortened space and then a huge jump when the image pops in or the content pops in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've talked to people about that, and some people feel like that's as it should be, that it's not going to preserve an empty empty hole if it's not sure that something's going to be there. But I'm generally with you, and likewise I also had tried to get it working with some sort of lazy loading scheme. So I could, just load the first image, get something on the screen quickly, and then go from there.
I mean, the reason why you can say that it's not correct is I have it on sites that are very heavily cached and load in sub 400 millisecond load times, and you still see that content bump. I mean, the entire page loads, and then, less than 40 milliseconds later, the image jumps down and the whole page moves. And
right.
It's not a performance thing. It's just
I'm saying like that. If it fails to load, then there's no trace of it being there. Yeah. And I think that's what some people would consider better. I'm not sure I agree. I'd rather load a single image and show that, and then just not have the sliding capability. But I'm not a JavaScript guy, so there's only so much I can do.
What a cop-out.
I know. It's terrible, isn't it?
I more took that as he's not a fan of JavaScript, but I get it now, I guess.
No, it's because I'm not smart, John. You of all people should have assumed that's what I meant.
I wrote my first JavaScript function the other day to modify the way login occurs in Drupal. So I had a requirement that there's a third item that gets recorded when somebody logs in that is tied directly to the device that they're on. So you can see, for example, if somebody's logging in on multiple devices and it's stored in local storage on the device, but you can only access local storage through JavaScript. You can't access it. Through PHP because it's not on the server.
Right. Interesting.
And what if JavaScript's not running on the device?
The whole world comes crashing down on your head, Steve.
So I haven't gone through the whole thing, but in general, if it's missing, it doesn't matter. It just generates one randomly.
Just ignores it?
Yeah.
You have a page not found there.
But I haven't actually tested that yet, but that's how it's supposed to work. So it's on my list of things to do.
All right, guys. I think we're at the end of episode 100. Jason, when can we have you back again? I mean, we booked you in this date, I think 5 months ago. So.
Well, I think
Can
it's
we
going to
pick
be a little bit easier for
another
me to.
day?
I think that we can, because we used to also had a conflicting thing going on here in our office, which has since moved. So I think I don't think it has to be another 5 months before I come back. I think we can make it a lot sooner than that. If you guys will have me.
We will have you anytime, but you're not willing to commit today.
It's just because we've got so many college drop-offs coming up in the next few weeks that I
better
can't
than
even
college
consider.
dropouts, I always say.
I don't know. It costs us less.
Ooh.
You'll
That's
get
right.
there eventually with your little
Right.
man.
Yeah, I could use a college dropout right now. Okay, so Jason, where can people find you online at your new place? Where should they reach out to you? And where could they buy your book?
Well, you can reach me at jpomentel on pretty much any social network. You can see me at freshtilledsoil.com if you're interested in the work that we do. And you can find my book. You can go to rwt.io. That's the website I put together for all of my web typography resources. And you can get links to the book there. It's available from O'Reilly and Amazon in pretty much any ebook and print format that you're looking for.
And it will be in our show notes as long as Jason adds it in the next 5 minutes. So you can refer to the show notes. How about you, John?
As always, you can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi. I will be in Newport tomorrow night for Newport Interactive Marketers, their annual event there where they go to the top of Newport, which is nice.
John, is there still time to attend that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Signed up?
You can pretty much just show up. Don't tell them I said that, but yeah, I usually just show up and it's you're good. So yeah, definitely still available. If you do a search on the web for Newport Interactive Marketers, their website should come up. And then you can always find me at the newly designed oomfink.com.
Awesome, thank you. How about you, Nick?
You can find me online at Nixman pretty much everywhere, NICXVAN, and at enlightened.net.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm Stephen Cross at Stephen Cross or parallaxinfotech.com. And we will be getting back together for this show in 2 weeks. And we have a guest host that day, which is Chris Wells.
Great. From Redfin, right?
Redfin, yes, right. Chris will be joining us on August 12th. And then we have the folks from Four Kitchens joining us on August 26th. All right, guys, take care. Have a good week. Talk to you soon.
Take care, guys.
Yeah, have a good one.